Elias grew up in a house where even the walls felt bruised. It was a structure built on tiptoes. A home where an unwashed cup or a misplaced sigh could trigger a landslide. You could feel the tension in the masonry, a heavy, static dread that clung to the curtains and poisoned the air. And although nobody inside that house knew it yet, every single day they survived there was quietly building the man Elias would eventually become. He still remembers the sound of his mother's breath catching, that sharp, jagged intake of air that happens right before the world breaks. He remembers his father's knuckles, black, tight, and unforgiving, like stones pulled from a frozen river. Those hands were the law. They didn't just inflict pain, they dictated the gravity of the entire house. When those knuckles knocked against wood, heart stopped. And somewhere inside a terrified little boy, another law was already being written. One that would eventually become just as dangerous. Elias spent the first decade of his life measuring the distance between his father's chair and the nearest exit, calculating escape routes in the dark. He learned to read the precise frequency of anger before it even materialized. He knew the difference between a drunk silence and a sober rage. Both were deadly. But one was calculated. He thought surviving this house was his greatest battle, but survival was only the first trap. The real danger was what this house was teaching him to become without him ever noticing. On the day he buried his mother, Elias didn't just say goodbye. He made a pact with the very dirt that covered her casket. He whispered a promise into the wind: I will never be him. I will never raise my hand. No matter the provocation. No matter how much I burn. I will be the man he wasn't. It sounded beautiful. Noble. Pure. The kind of promise people applaud, completely unaware that some promises become prisons when life starts testing them. To understand the weight of that promise, you have to understand the night it was forged. Elias was only 10 years old, hiding beneath a rusted iron bed frame while a tropical thunderstorm tore at the roof. He remembers the smell of cheap local gin mixed with the metallic tang of fear. He remembers the rhythmic, heavy thud of his father's leather boots marching down the hallway, a sound that meant judgment had arrived. Through the floorboards, he watched his mother cornered against the kitchen cupboard, her hands raised not to fight, but to beg. He watched a giant of a man break a woman's spirit using nothing but raw, unchecked gravity. And every second he spent witnessing, that destruction was quietly etching itself into his nervous system, becoming a blueprint he would carry for decades without knowing it. That night, young Elias squeezed his eyes shut and swallowed his own screams, tasting copper and shame. He swore to God, to the universe, to anything listening in the dark, that he would swallow fire before he ever became a source of pain. He didn't know that trauma isn't just a memory. It's a blueprint. He thought that by burying his anger, he was burying the monster. He believed that goodness was simply the absence of violence. He didn't know that an empty house is the easiest one to break into. He thought his restraint was an iron wall. He was about to find out it was a glass ceiling. And glass ceilings have a terrifying habit: they don't collapse immediately. They wait until someone places enough weight on them first. It was a noble vow. A sacred monument built to honor a woman who died in fear. But Elias didn't realize a terrifying truth about human nature, that when you build a monument, you also build a shadow. And shadows are patient. They don't attack immediately. They simply follow you, waiting for the exact moment your greatest virtue becomes your greatest vulnerability. Because the trap had already been built. Elias simply hadn't walked into it yet, but he was much closer than he realized. And by disarming himself in the name of love, he had unknowingly handed his wife the very weapon his father once used to destroy. He didn't know he was walking into the autopsy of his manhood. Tragedies like this rarely begin with evil people. They begin with good people who misunderstand how the world actually works. He didn't know that some people don't want a protector, they want a victim. And Sarah was already looking for the cracks in his armor. She didn't look at his peace as a virtue, she looked at it as a vulnerability. Every relationship has a predator and a prey, and by declaring himself a pacifist, Elias had painted a target directly onto his chest. The countdown had already begun. The terrifying part wasn't that the countdown had begun. It was that Elias couldn't hear it ticking yet. In the beginning, that secret was a bridge. It was a holy confession. A bridge built on the naive assumption that showing someone your deepest wounds makes them want to heal you. Early in their marriage, in a moment of raw, shivering honesty, Elias told Sarah about the darkness he came from. He shared the scars on his soul so she would understand the softness in his heart. He told her she was safe. He told her that no matter how high the flames of an argument rose, his hands would stay firmly at his sides. He thought he was giving her peace. Instead, he gave her a map of his weaknesses. And maps have a purpose. They exist so people know exactly where to go when they decide to invade. That's what honest men do. They hand people the knives and trust them not to stab. They lay their throat bare, believing that love is a shield against cruelty. But love without boundaries is just an invitation to be conquered. When you tell someone exactly how to destroy you, you have to pray they love you more than they love power. Sarah loved power. And power is addictive. Once someone discovers there are no consequences attached to their cruelty, they almost never stop at the first victory. They simply become hungrier. The first crack had already appeared. The collapse itself was only a matter of time, but Elias still believed he was building a marriage instead of digging a grave. Cruelty is a slow-growing vine. It didn't happen all at once. It started with a shove during a heated debate. A moment where she tested the boundary to see if the good man was real. Then came a glass of water thrown in frustration. Then, the first slap. Predators rarely begin with violence. They begin with experiments. The first slap happened over something stupid. Burnt rice. The rice was irrelevant. What mattered was the answer she received afterward. No resistance. No consequences. No fear. The burnt rice was just the initiation. Over the next 7 years, the kitchen became a courtroom where Elias was always found guilty. He remembers the third year, during a small dinner gathering with their closest friends. A minor disagreement arose over finances, and right there, in front of everyone, Sarah looked at him with a smile sweeter than venom, and said, "Elias wouldn't understand how real money works, his mind is as fragile as his upbringing." The room went dead silent. The guests stared at their plates, suffocating in the awkwardness. Elias just sat there, his fingers locking around his napkin underneath the table until his joints popped. He cleared his throat, forced a smile, and excused himself to wash the dishes. He became a master of cleaning up his own public executions. And every humiliation he silently survived was quietly teaching Sarah a dangerous lesson, that she could go further next time. Sarah realized that his tolerance for humiliation was a bottomless well. She tested him in public, she tested him in private, treating his dignity like a rag she could use to wipe her shoes. He remembers the sound of her rings clicking against his teeth on a Tuesday afternoon because he forgot to lock the back door. He remembers the way she would look at him afterward, not with fear, not with regret, but with a cold, analytical curiosity. She was measuring how much of his soul she could carve away before he bled. And while she was measuring him, something else was being measured too. The amount of pressure a human being can absorb before something ancient finally wakes up. And Elias? He just stood there, swallowing the copper taste in his mouth, repeating his childhood mantra like a prayer, "I am not my father. I am breaking the cycle." He was bleeding internally so his home could look clean on the outside. The sting was a shock, but the silence that followed was worse. Elias stood there in the center of his kitchen, his feet planted like a statue, his eyes closed. He was a martyr for his own trauma. He told himself he was being strong. He told himself he was breaking the cycle. But philosophy is a cold comfort when your face is burning. Every time her palm hit his skin, a different cycle was beginning. A predatory one. Sarah realized there were no consequences for her rage. She began to feast on his restraint. She didn't see a good man anymore. She saw a door that wouldn't lock. A target that refused to strike back. Silence does not always look like strength. Sometimes, it looks like permission. And permission, once granted long enough, eventually transforms into expectation. For 7 years, Elias wore that shame like an undershirt, close to the skin, hidden from the world. Years passed. And slowly, Elias began disappearing. The frightening thing about disappearing is that nobody notices immediately, until one day there's almost nothing left to save. But a man cannot disappear completely in his own house. Eventually, the shadows he was trying to hide from his son found a way into the light. Because the tragedy of a quiet victim is that their silence speaks louder than any scream. Elias thought his suffering was a closed loop. He was about to find out that his son was already fluent in the language of his defeat. And children learn much faster than adults realize. They don't wait for lessons. They simply absorb reality. He thought he was protecting his son, Leo. He thought if he took the blows in silence, the boy would only ever see a home of peace. He genuinely believed he could absorb all the poison in the house and keep the child's world pure. He thought his back was broad enough to carry the weight of 2 monsters. Children are always watching. They don't listen to what you teach, they emulate what you tolerate. They possess an ancient, terrifying ability to see through the dynamic of their parents. Leo didn't see a peaceful home. He saw a sanctuary where violence was tolerated and goodness was punished. And once a child learns that lesson, the future begins rewriting itself before anyone notices. The damage was no longer contained between husband and wife anymore. It had already crossed into the next generation, and Elias was about to discover that in the most painful way possible. Until the school called. Sometimes life doesn't expose your mistakes with punishment, it exposes them with a mirror. Elias sat in a small plastic chair in the hallway, looking like a giant in a world of miniatures. The smell of floor wax and children's glue felt thick, almost claustrophobic. The squeak of his own leather shoes against the linoleum felt like an accusation. The brightly colored drawings of happy families on the walls felt like a direct mockery of his existence. The teacher didn't speak. She just slid a piece of notebook paper across the desk. Handwritten. Shaky. Blue ink on lined paper. It was a simple assignment, write about your hero. The paper looked harmless, completely unaware that a single sheet of paper was about to dismantle 7 years of self-deception. Elias expected to read about superheroes who could fly. Instead, the words on that paper tore through his soul like a serrated blade. Written in large, shaky, childhood print, the sentence read, "My hero is my dad, because no matter how many times mommy hurts him, he never stops her. When I grow up, I want to be a good man just like him." In that moment, the room went ice cold. Elias didn't see a hero in those words. He saw a tragedy. That sentence hit harder than any slap ever could. It bypassed the skin and went straight for the marrow of his identity. It shattered the carefully constructed lie he had been telling himself for 7 years. Because lies become the most dangerous when they're built from good intentions. He realized his strength was actually a poison. He wasn't teaching his son how to be a man of peace, he was teaching him how to be a victim of war. He was showing his son that love is a place where you accept pain as a price of admission. He was building a legacy of submission. He was raising a lamb for the slaughterhouse, and he was the one who had sharpened the blade. Every slap Leo witnessed became another brick in the foundation of the man he would someday become. Would he mistake weakness for goodness? The vow wasn't a shield anymore. It was a shroud. And it was suffocating the next generation. And once Elias finally saw it, he could never unsee it again. That was the moment Elias realized you cannot stop a fire by simply standing in the flames. Sometimes, you have to put the fire out. Fear entered Elias's heart. Not fear of Sarah. Fear of what his silence was teaching. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of being hurt anymore. He was afraid of becoming an accomplice. He drove home that afternoon with the windows rolled up, the silence inside the car louder than any engine. He looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror, and for the first time in 7 years, he didn't see his mother's protector. He saw his father's accomplice. He didn't understand the nightmare, or how easily he had walked right into it. He realized that by refusing to fight the monster, he had become its caretaker. He knew that by 5 o'clock, the storm inside his house would demand a final, definitive answer. The fuse had been lit in that elementary school hallway. The explosion was waiting in the kitchen. And explosions are terrifying because once they begin, there is no way to put the pieces back together afterward. Rain hit the windowpane that evening with a rhythm like a drumbeat. Elias stood by the kitchen sink, the essay folded in his pocket, feeling like a ticking bomb. He watched the water run over his hands, watching the soap bubbles circle the drain, counting the seconds. Every drop of rain against the glass felt like a heartbeat accelerating toward zero. The clock wasn't counting down toward an argument anymore. It was counting down toward the death of an identity. Sarah entered the room with the casual air of a dictator. She didn't see a man, she saw a punching bag that paid the bills. She brought with her the familiar scent of cold rain and unprovoked hostility. She walked into the room expecting the usual surrender, completely blind to the fact that the atmosphere had changed. Completely blind to the fact that 7 years of pressure had finally found its breaking point. Elias didn't answer. He was looking at his son's bedroom door. Through the reflection in the dark kitchen window, he saw the shadow of a 7-year-old boy watching through the crack. Leo was waiting for the show. Waiting to see his hero take another blow. Waiting to learn how to surrender. Elias realized that if he took one more hit, his son's destiny would be sealed in concrete. And some decisions become terrifying because they no longer belong to you alone. Sarah stepped closer. Her face was twisted into that familiar mask of entitlement. Her eyes immediately landed on a small puddle of tea beside the sink. Elias had left a careless spill on the floor. It was insignificant. Almost laughably insignificant. But that had never really been the point. The excuse didn't matter anymore. 7 years of unchecked power had taught Sarah that any inconvenience, no matter how small, was enough to justify her anger. She raised her hand, the same arc, the same practice motion she had used 1,000 times. She expected the flinch. She expected him to close his eyes and offer his cheek to the altar of his vow. The raised hand. The familiar swing. The automatic violence she no longer even thought about. Routine had made her arrogant. She no longer believed resistance even existed. But this time, her hand stopped 6 inches from his face. Elias's fingers were clamped around her wrist like a steel vice. His knuckles were black, just like his father's, but there was a terrifying, frozen control in them. It wasn't the frantic grasp of a man panicking, it was the heavy latch of a cage door locking shut. The pressure he exerted was exactly enough to immobilize her, not a millimeter less, not a millimeter more. Except this time, something was different. For the first time in 7 years, Elias looked her in the eyes. And the woman who had spent a decade ruling through fear finally saw what she had been poking. She didn't see the broken boy from the bruised house anymore. She saw the reservoir of 7 years of unexpressed fury, frozen into a single glare. She saw a dam that had just cracked. And cracked dams don't negotiate. They simply release everything they have been holding back. Gentle does not mean weak. The gentleman was gone. The martyr had been buried. The ghost of his father had finally arrived, but he wasn't there to destroy. He was there to reclaim his house. Or at least, that's what he desperately wanted to believe. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't drop his glare. He simply turned her wrist, shifting the center of gravity in that kitchen forever. He dragged her toward the back room, his grip unyielding, his footsteps heavy and deliberate against the floorboards. As the bedroom door began to swing shut, Elias felt the final thread of his old life snap. The man who entered that room would not be the same man who walked out. What lay beyond that door was the absolute demolition of his sacred vow. And demolished vows have consequences that don't reveal themselves immediately, they reveal themselves afterward. He led her toward the bedroom. No screaming. No names. Just a heavy, suffocating stillness. He closed the door, and the click of the lock sounded like a gunshot in the quiet house. That click was the sound of the world ending. It was the boundary line between the man he swore he would be and the man he needed to become to save his bloodline. Years of humiliation collapsed all at once. He realized that mercy without boundaries is just slow-motion suicide. And a man who cannot protect himself can never truly protect his son. He didn't beat her to break her bones. He beat her to break the illusion. The illusion that he was weak. The illusion that his vow was a white flag. He showed her the strength he had been using to hold the world together, and for the first time, he turned that strength against the person who had mocked it. What happened inside that room was ugly. Not cinematic. Not heroic. Ugly. It was the violent recalibration of a broken dynamic. It was the sound of a man tearing down his own monument to build a wall. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of generational trauma refusing to be denied, demanding its payment in blood and terror. But buried pain always sends an invoice eventually. The only uncertainty is who will be forced to pay it. Outside in the dim hallway, 7-year-old Leo stood perfectly still against the wall. He didn't cry. He didn't move. He just stared at the closed bedroom door with wide, unblinking eyes as the sounds inside rewrote everything he thought he knew about his father. His hero had become something else entirely, and he was far too young to understand what that something was. 7 years of watching his father surrender had ended in a single night, and the lesson replacing it would follow him for the rest of his life. When he opened the door and walked out, he was breathing hard. His back was straight. Sarah remained on the floor. She wasn't crying with the loud, manipulative wail of an argument. She was breathing in jagged, terrified gasps. The sting on her skin was a revelation. She looked at him and realized the most dangerous truth of all: he hadn't been taking her blows because he had to. He had been taking them because he chose to. And today, he chose differently. But choices like these never end when they're made. That's when their consequences actually begin. The next morning, the sun rose over the house, but it brought no warmth. The kitchen was bathed in a pale, clinical light. Because some mornings don't feel like new beginnings. They feel like crime scenes after the sirens have left. Sarah sat at the dining table, her posture shrunk, her shoulders curved inward like a dying leaf. She held a mug of tea with both hands, her eyes fixed entirely on the checkered tablecloth, tracking the steam as it vanished into the air. Power had left the room, but fear had stayed behind. When Elias walked into the room, she didn't scream, she didn't threaten, she didn't look up. She simply flinched, a tiny, involuntary tremor that ran through her spine. She had been stripped of her crown, and she was realizing that the man she had been torturing was actually a sleeping giant. And sleeping giants are dangerous because once they awaken, nobody knows how long they'll stay awake. Elias didn't say a word. He placed a plate of toast on the table. Then, the door opened, and little Leo walked in, his school bag slung over one shoulder. The boy looked at his mother on the floor of her pride, then he looked at his father's right hand, reddened, heavy, resting on the kitchen counter. Leo didn't smile. He didn't look relieved. He looked at his father with a brand new expression, absolute, unblinking terror. And in that instant, Elias understood that victories can sometimes look exactly like defeats. Elias saw it. And in that quiet morning light, the victory tasted like ash. He had saved his son from learning submission, but he had just given him a masterclass in fear. He had killed the victim, but in doing so, he had resurrected the oppressor. He had spent his entire life trying to outrun his father, only to discover that unresolved pain always knows the way home. The cycle was broken, but the air in the house would never be the same. The good man had died to let this father live. Or maybe, the two had simply traded places. Sarah stayed. The slap stopped that day. The screaming died down to a whisper. The balance of power shifted, but the foundation was cracked forever. Tyranny had simply changed hands. The house was peaceful now, but it was the peace of a graveyard after the battle is over. And graveyard peace carries its own curse. because silence built on fear is never true peace at all. The war was over, but the consequences had only just begun. Elias saved his son from becoming a victim, but he stays awake at night wondering if he taught him a darker lesson. Did he teach his son that peace only comes through the threat of violence? Did he prove his father right? Did he show Leo that the only way to survive love is to dominate it? Because the most terrifying battles are the ones that don't end when the fighting stops, they continue inside your own mind. He looks at his hands, large, powerful, dangerous. He kept his promise for 7 years. He lost it in 7 minutes. Sometimes a single moment can erase years of discipline, but leave behind a lifetime of questions. Suppressing anger is not the same as healing it. He understands it now, the truth his father never told him. It is easy to be a saint when the world is kind. It is easy to be a man of peace when no one is throwing stones. Buried rage doesn't disappear. It waits. It feeds on your endurance, growing stronger in the dark, until it becomes heavy enough to break the cage. And when it finally escapes, it doesn't care who it destroys, even if it's the very thing you tore yourself apart to protect. Because buried emotions never die. They simply become patient. But the hardest thing a man will ever do is decide which vow to break, when the person he loves is the one holding the hammer. And some choices don't have happy endings. They only have prices. Elias broke his promise to the dirt. But he kept his house. The question is, what is left inside it? Because a house can survive, while everything that made it a home quietly disappears. So, ask yourself, did he break the cycle? Or did he just start a new one? And that's the terrifying part, because the answer isn't obvious anymore. Maybe his son will grow up remembering the years his father stayed silent. Or maybe he'll remember the one night his father finally exploded. Either way, a lesson was taught. The only question left is which one will survive longer. Subscribe to Naratox for the next chapter.